There is a filing cabinet in Washington that holds the voices of the dead, not recordings, transcriptions, thousands of pages, quiet pages, typed by government workers who sat at kitchen tables between 1936 and 1940 and wrote down what the elderly still remembered before their memories disappeared. Here's the contradiction. If America remembers its past so clearly, why did it need to rush into private homes and capture the stories of the old before they were gone? And why were those stories placed in boxes and left unread for decades? The program was called the Federal Writers Project. Out-of-work journalists were sent across 24 states with a simple instruction: sit, listen, record. They collected 2,900 life histories. Men and women born in the 1840s, the 1850s, some earlier. People who had seen an America that no longer existed. People who had grown up before the Great Fires, before the orphan trains ended, before entire cities were rebuilt in a different image. Official history says the 19th century was a time of steady progress, wooden towns becoming brick, horse becoming rail, candle becoming electric light. But when you listen carefully to those old interviews, something feels misaligned. The scale of memory does not match the scale of the story we are told. Consider the arithmetic. A woman born in 1855 who lived to 85 would have died in 1940. She would have been alive when the government knocked on her door. She would have been a child in 1871, old enough to remember the sky turning red, old enough to remember buildings that seemed older than the dates carved into their stone. Her grandchildren, born in the 1920s, would have heard those stories directly from her voice. That generation, now almost gone, is the last human bridge to a different America. An America described not in textbooks, but in kitchens. The Writers Project preserved fragments of that bridge, but only fragments. 2,900 accounts from a nation of millions. And then, in 1939, the funding ended. The interviews were boxed, filed, forgotten. Why stop recording the memories of the last witnesses just as they were about to disappear? That question followed me into the archives. I was not looking for elderly voices. I was tracing courthouse records from the 1870s, studying proportions, doorways too tall, ceilings too vast, windows placed as if meant for a different sense of scale. The buildings unsettled me, but the people unsettled me more. Because architecture stands in stone, memory stands in breath, and breath can be interrupted. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s had lived through what historians call Reconstruction. They had watched entire cities burn in a single night. They had watched maps change. They had watched children disappear onto westbound trains. They had watched magnificent exhibition cities rise and vanish. And then, in their final years, they watched the country insist that everything had unfolded in a simple, orderly progression. Wood to brick, mud to marble, frontier to modernity. But some of them described something else, something that does not fit neatly into that line. Not accusations, not theories, just observations. A building that seemed older than it claimed, a fire that moved in ways no ordinary blaze should move. A town rebuilt so quickly, it felt as if foundations had already been waiting beneath the ashes. Their words are still there, in a cabinet, in the Library of Congress, waiting. The paradox is simple. If nothing was lost, why were the last witnesses gathered so urgently? And if everything was preserved, why does it feel as though something enormous slipped through our hands? The old Americans are gone now, but their transcribed voices remain. And archives do not forget, not even when families do October 8th, 1871. Every American child is taught one fire. Chicago, a barn, a cow, a wooden city. A lesson about rebuilding. But that same night, at nearly the same hour, flames moved across 3 states: Peshtigo, Wisconsin; Holland, Michigan; Manistee; Port Huron. Entire towns swallowed in wind and fire. The official explanation is simple: drought, logging debris, a cold front, high winds, all reasonable, and yet. Witnesses described air that could not be breathed, people found without burns, as if the oxygen itself had vanished, flames that leapt faster than a man could run. Heat so intense that clothing ignited before skin was touched. Reverend Peter Pernin survived by submerging himself in the river. He wrote later that the fire behaved as if it had a center, as if it detonated outward, not creeping, not spreading, but erupting, across forests, across towns, across counties. The simultaneity remains, multiple cities igniting in the same evening. The National Weather Service confirms the timing. But timing alone raises a quiet question. How often does devastation strike so evenly? The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s were children that night. A 70-year-old in 1938 would have been 3 years old in 1871. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to stand outside and see the horizon glow, old enough to hear their parents whisper about what they saw in the sky. Those whispers do not always survive in official reports. They survive in families, in memory. And memory is fragile. The Writers' Project transcripts contain passing references to the Great Burning, to towns that vanished overnight, to rebuilding that seemed hurried. Sometimes the language feels restrained, as if the speaker does not want to wander too far from what sounds acceptable. There is a pattern in such restraint. When an event is too large, it becomes easier to describe only its edges. Chicago rebuilt in brick and stone. But brick and stone require preparation. Stone requires quarries. Brick requires kilns. Infrastructure requires planning. How does a region devastated across millions of acres rebuild so swiftly? Some accounts mention foundations already standing, walls that seemed older than the dates newly carved into them. Perhaps that is coincidence. Perhaps not. The fire was not the only disappearance. In 1890, the United States conducted its most detailed census, 62 million names. Immigration status, language, homeownership. An entire nation documented during the very decades when cities were burning and rebuilding. For the first time, copies were not stored locally. There was only one set, in a basement in Washington. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out there. Some records burned. Others were soaked. Half survived. For 12 years they sat, unrestored, untouched. Then, in 1933, Congress authorized their destruction. The cornerstone of the National Archives was laid the next day. One day. The most complete record of Americans alive during the transition period, gone. Of 62 million names, only fragments remain. Fire, neglect, authorization, each step reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a sequence. The elderly witnesses interviewed in the 1930s lived precisely in that erased corridor of time, born before the burning, alive during the rebuilding, speaking just before their memories vanished. What did they notice? What did they feel had changed? Their transcripts rarely accuse. They describe. And description, when patient enough, can reveal more than accusation ever could. Something shifted in the 1870s, not gradually, but abruptly. Architecture altered, maps redrew, records thinned, and the last Americans who saw both worlds sat quietly in their kitchens, telling stories that did not quite fit the printed page. Between 1854 and 1929, trains carried children west. 250,000 of them. They left from New York, from Boston, from Philadelphia. They arrived in rural towns where families gathered along the tracks. The children were lined up, inspected, chosen. Some were true orphans, many were not. They were sons and daughters of immigrants, of widows, of the poor, families who could not feed them, or could not fight the institutions that claimed to help. The movement was described as charitable, rescue, opportunity, and perhaps for some, it was. But records were thin, names were changed, origins blurred. Older children were encouraged to stop speaking of where they had come from. Contact with siblings often ended at the station platform. Identity, once broken, does not easily mend. 250,000 Americans whose beginnings were obscured by design. The timing overlaps. The fires of 1871, the census of 1890, the great exhibitions of the 1890s, the architectural shift. The orphan trains ran through all of it. When a community loses its records and then loses its children, something more than population is altered. Memory thins, family lines blur, stories become harder to verify. The Writers' Project transcripts sometimes capture elderly Americans who mention being sent west. They speak softly about new names, about forgetting old streets, about not knowing where they were born, not with anger, with distance, as if the separation had become normal. If an entire generation grows up disconnected from its origin, who carries forward the older stories? Oral memory depends on continuity. Grandmother to mother, mother to child. Break that chain once, and the story stutters. Break it thousands of times, and the story fades. During the same decades, photographs circulate of buildings that appear complete beyond their claimed age. Capitals rising in frontier towns. Courthouses with domes rivaling Europe. Rail stations with ceilings too high for soot-blackened engines. The official record says they were built quickly. Temporary materials, wood frames covered in plaster. Yet the images show symmetry, detail. Stone that looks older than its dedication plaques. Elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s remembered visiting the great fairs. Chicago, 1893. They walked through what was called the White City. Columns, domes, lagoons reflecting marble facades. 27 million visitors, 6 months. Then demolition. Almost every structure gone. The explanation: they were never meant to last. But some who stood there as children described something else. Not spectacle, familiarity. As if the city felt less temporary than the story later told about it. As if it resembled something already known, something remembered, and then erased. When memory and monument do not align, which do we trust? Stone can be moved, paper can burn, children can be renamed, but memory lingers for a while, until the last witness closes her eyes. Somewhere in the early 1950s, in quiet American towns, elderly women born in the 1850s sat surrounded by grandchildren. They had seen 2 Americas, one before the burning, one after, and when they spoke of the first, the room often grew silent. Because their descriptions did not match the lessons in school books. In 1893, Chicago unveiled a city that seemed to arrive from another age. The world's Columbian Exposition. 630 acres, more than 200 buildings, domes rising like cathedrals, columns carved in classical proportion, statues arranged with deliberate symmetry. They called it the White City. Official accounts say it was built in less than 2 years. Wooden frames, plaster facades, temporary intention. Constructed with horse-drawn equipment, hand tools, manual labor. And then, after 6 months, almost all of it was removed, dismantled, burned, erased. The explanation is practical. The fair was temporary. The materials were not meant to endure. Yet photographs remain. Wide boulevards, grand staircases, reflections in still water. The scale feels permanent. The detail feels studied. Visitors wrote of awe, of walking through spaces that felt older than the nation itself. Some elderly Americans, interviewed decades later, recalled standing there as children. They described proportions that felt right, as if the city had not been improvised, but remembered, not constructed, but revealed. Then it vanished. The pattern repeats beyond Chicago. Paris, 1889. Buffalo, 1901. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. Monumental cities assembled, displayed, then dismantled. Each time, the explanation is efficiency, temporary celebration. But what does it mean to build so grandly, only to remove it so completely? What is gained by demolition? The transcripts from the 1930s sometimes mention fairs in passing. An elderly man recalling the great white buildings. An elderly woman remembering light reflecting off domes at night. They rarely question how it was built. They simply describe what they saw. Their descriptions carry no suspicion, only familiarity, as if such architecture was not astonishing, but expected. This is where the contradiction deepens. If America in the late 19th century was still becoming modern, if resources were scarce, if infrastructure was still forming, how did cities of such coherence rise so quickly? And why were they so thoroughly erased? Around the same decades, maps quietly shifted, place names altered, territories redrawn. Some large regions labeled differently in earlier charts, then simplified later. The transitions are subtle, rarely discussed. Architecture shifts as well. Grand classical courthouses of the 1870s give way to plainer forms by the early 20th century. Ceilings lower, entrances narrower, ornament reduced, progress perhaps, or adaptation. But adaptation to what? The elderly witnesses born before 1860 had seen the larger scale. They had walked through streets with proportions that felt expansive. They had seen structures that did not seem experimental. They did not speak of invention. They spoke of inheritance. And when they tried to explain this to grandchildren raised on a different narrative, they often softened their tone. Memory becomes careful when it contradicts authority. The White City lasted 6 months, but its image lingered in the minds of those who saw it. And when they described it decades later, their words did not sound like fantasy. They sounded like recollection, measured, unembellished, a city that rose and was removed, a generation that remembered and then was gone. By the early 1950s, the witnesses were very old. Women born before the Civil War. Men who remembered horse teams in streets that would later hold automobiles. People who had seen wooden towns replaced by stone, and then stone replaced by something simpler. Imagine one of them, a woman born in 1858, 95 years old in 1953, sitting in a narrow house on a quiet American street. Her grandchildren visit on Sundays. They bring newspapers. They speak of television, of rockets being tested in distant deserts. She listens, and sometimes she speaks. She speaks of a night when the sky glowed red beyond the fields, of wind that did not behave like ordinary wind, of buildings in her childhood town that seemed older than the dates engraved above their doors. She describes ceilings so high that voices echoed, doorways so tall that men never needed to bow. She speaks of children arriving by train who did not know their real names. Her grandchildren nod. They do not argue, but they do not fully believe, because the textbooks say the 19th century was a time of humble beginnings, rough timber, small settlements, trial and error. Her memories do not match that modest picture. So the room grows quiet. This is how transitions solidify, not through argument, through polite silence. The Writers' Project captured some of these voices in the 1930s, but many were never recorded. 24 states were visited, 24 were not. 2,900 life histories were preserved. Millions were not. By the time the transcripts were finally published widely in the 1970s, most of the speakers had been gone for decades, and most of their grandchildren were already old, or gone as well. What remains now is paper. Handwritten recollections typed into government forms, fragments of kitchens and porches, descriptions of towns rebuilt so quickly that the rebuilding felt inevitable, descriptions of fires that behaved strangely, descriptions of architecture that felt inherited rather than invented. None of these testimonies shout. They do not accuse. They simply observe. An observation, when repeated across counties and states, begins to form an outline of a transition that was not gradual, but abrupt. The 1850s through the 1870s appear dense with permanence. Grand structures, elaborate design, confidence in scale, then the burning, the relocation of children, the disappearance of detailed census records, the demolition of monumental fairs, and finally, the fading of the last living memory. If there was a different America before the transition, its final custodians died in the mid-20th century. Not dramatically, quietly, in bedrooms with lace curtains, with stories that no longer fit the official arc. The question is not whether they were mistaken. The question is whether we have read them carefully enough. The filing cabinet still exists, metal drawers, manila folders, typed pages aging quietly in controlled air. Inside them are the voices of Americans born before the transition, not myths, not legends, memories. A farmer describing a courthouse that felt older than the town around it. A seamstress recalling ceilings so high that winter heat never reached them. A former child of the orphan trains speaking of a name that was not the one she was born with. A man remembering the red horizon of 1871 as something more than an ordinary blaze. None of them use grand language. They do not frame their memories as mysteries. They speak plainly. And that plainness is what unsettles. Because when ordinary people describe extraordinary shifts, the absence of explanation becomes its own presence. The timeline is visible, the fires in 1871, the census of 1890, documented once, then burned, then destroyed. The fairs that rose and vanished, the relocation of children whose pasts dissolved on arrival, the defunding of the Writers' Project just as the oldest witnesses were fading. Each event stands alone as plausible. Together, they form a corridor, a narrow passage between one America and another. The official story emphasizes progress, but progress is usually gradual. This feels different, abrupt, as if a page was turned too quickly. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s stood with one foot in each world. They remembered larger proportions, different rhythms of life, knowledge carried through craft rather than manuals. They did not articulate a theory. They did not need to. They simply described what they had seen. And then they died. Their grandchildren chose practicality. The modern world required adaptation, not reflection. So the stories thinned. The filing cabinet remained. Accessible, public, uncelebrated. Somewhere among those 2,900 transcripts may be a sentence that does not fit. A detail about stone that seems too weathered for its dedication date. A remark about a sky that behaved unlike any storm remembered since. A casual line about a building that felt inherited, not constructed. The documents do not argue. They wait. Archives are patient. Stone is patient. Memory, for a time, is patient. But human chains are fragile. The last Americans who could say, "I remember before," are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone. Soon, there will be no living link at all. Only paper. Only architecture. Only the quiet contradictions that remain for those willing to sit with them. If something changed in the late 19th century, it did not announce itself loudly. It settled into place. It allowed the old to fade. It replaced inheritance with narrative. And then it moved on. The question is not what was hidden. The question is what was quietly set aside. In a filing cabinet, in plain sight, waiting for someone to read what the last witnesses actually said.